We all know the story of the Renaissance. It's a glorious highlight in our history books. A rebirth of art and culture. The age of undisputed geniuses like Leonardo and Michelangelo. A time when humanity stepped out of the so-called Dark Ages and into the light. But what if that story is a beautifully crafted lie? What if the serene beauty of Botticelli's Venus and the divine perfection of the Sistine Chapel were built on a foundation of bloodshed, political assassination, and mass suffering? What if the golden age of art was bankrolled by brutal warlords and corrupt popes? Tonight, we're tearing down the myth of the peaceful Renaissance. We're going to uncover the violent, cynical, and ruthless truth that has been hiding in plain sight, proving that this celebrated rebirth was, for millions of people, a living nightmare. The popular image of Renaissance Italy is of enlightened city-states, bustling with artists and philosophers. The reality? For much of this period, Italy wasn't a cradle of peace, but a continental battleground. From 1494 to 1559, the peninsula was engulfed in a series of conflicts we now call the Italian Wars. These weren't some kind of noble contest, they were a chaotic and brutal free-for-all. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian city-states themselves like Florence, Venice, and the Papal States were locked in a constantly shifting web of alliances and betrayals, all fighting for control of the wealthy peninsula. Historians of the time, like Guicciardini, wrote that this new style of warfare, brought by foreign armies, was terrifying. It replaced older, more ritualized forms of conflict with sheer, unrestrained bloodshed. Armies of mercenaries, loyal only to their next paycheck, marched across the land, leaving devastation in their wake. Sieges didn't just end in surrender, they ended in massacres. The climax of this brutality was the infamous sack of Rome in 1527. A mutinous, unpaid army of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V descended on the heart of Christendom. For weeks, the soldiers rampaged through the city, committing unspeakable atrocities. They looted churches, destroyed ancient art, and murdered thousands of civilians in the streets. The city's population plummeted from over 55,000 to as low as 10,000. The Swiss Guard was annihilated trying to defend the Pope, who was forced to flee and later pay an enormous ransom for his life. This was the world the Renaissance masters lived in. Not an ivory tower of artistic creation, but a landscape defined by constant, horrific violence. So who was paying for all this magnificent art amidst the chaos? The answer lies with the patrons' families who wielded power not with ideals, but with cold, hard cash and even colder steel. They were the godfathers of the Renaissance. First, let's talk about the Medici family of Florence. We remember them as the ultimate patrons of the arts, sponsoring figures like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. But their business wasn't art. Their business was power. The Medici Bank made them one of the wealthiest families in Europe, and they used that wealth to control Florence from behind the scenes. Their rule wasn't peaceful. They faced constant threats, and they responded with utter ruthlessness. The most infamous example is the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. During High Mass in the Florence Cathedral, assassins hired by a rival family, with the blessing of Pope Sixtus IV, attacked Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times and bled to death on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo was wounded but managed to escape. The Medici's revenge was swift and public. The conspirators, including an archbishop, were captured and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio, their bodies left dangling for all of Florence to see. This wasn't just justice, it was a brutal statement of power. And then you have the Borgias. If the Medici were masters of political maneuvering, the Borgias were masters of raw, unadulterated corruption. Originally from Spain, their patriarch, Rodrigo Borgia, bribed his way to the papacy, becoming Pope Alexander VI. He used the highest office in the Catholic Church as a tool for his family's ambition. His son, Cesare Borgia, was a brilliant and utterly ruthless military commander who carved out a kingdom for himself through violence and treachery. He was so famously skilled at using violence for political ends that he became the direct inspiration for Niccolò Machiavelli's notorious book, The Prince. The Borgia name became a byword for poison, assassination, and depravity, hosting lavish orgies in the Vatican, while their enemies mysteriously disappeared. These were the men commissioning breathtaking frescoes and serene Madonnas. Their power, built on intimidation and murder, is what funded the Golden Age. This brings us to a crucial point. The art of the Renaissance wasn't separate from the violence. In fact, it was often a direct result of it. Art was the ultimate form of political propaganda. When a ruthless ruler or a corrupt pope commissioned a chapel, an altarpiece, or a portrait, they weren't just celebrating beauty, they were sending a message. They were demonstrating their wealth, their piety, and most importantly, their power. Lavish commissions helped legitimize rule that was often obtained through violent or illegitimate means. Think of the grand portraits of dukes in shining armor or frescoes depicting a patron's family right alongside saints. These weren't just images, they were carefully constructed advertisements for the ruler's authority. By funding magnificent public works, families like the Medici could position themselves as benevolent leaders and cultural pioneers, effectively washing their blood-soaked money in the public eye and solidifying their grip on power. The art was a beautiful mask, hiding the ugly face of power. It created a legacy of cultural achievement that has successfully obscured the brutal reality of how that achievement was financed. Every serene painting and majestic sculpture was also a power play, a symbol of dominance in a world governed by fear. The violence wasn't just confined to the political squabbles of Italy. The Renaissance also coincided with one of the most violent religious upheavals in European history, the Protestant Reformation. While Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, Martin Luther was challenging the authority of the Pope, splintering Christendom, and unleashing a century of horrific religious warfare. One of the most infamous episodes of this sectarian hatred was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France in 1572. The violence began just days after a royal wedding intended to bring peace between Catholics and French Protestants, known as Huguenots. Instead, a wave of coordinated assassinations against Huguenot leaders in Paris, likely ordered by the Queen, Catherine de' Medici, spiraled into a city-wide massacre. Catholic mobs, gripped by religious frenzy, hunted down and slaughtered thousands of their Protestant neighbors. Men, women, and children were murdered in their homes and in the streets. One of the first victims was the Huguenot leader, Admiral Coligny, who was killed and thrown from his window. The violence spread from Paris to the countryside, and in the weeks that followed, tens of thousands of people were killed across France. How was the news received? Pope Gregory XIII was so pleased he had a special medal struck to commemorate the event and commissioned Giorgio Vasari to paint frescoes celebrating the massacre in the Vatican. This wasn't a fringe event. It was state-sponsored terror, fueled by religious intolerance, happening right in the heart of Renaissance Europe. And beneath the grand narratives of popes, princes, and artists are the forgotten victims, the people whose suffering was the bedrock of Renaissance society. You see, the rebirth of classical ideals didn't extend to everyone. While humanism celebrated the potential of man, it was a very specific type of man. For many, this era was one of increasing oppression. One of the darkest, most overlooked truths of the Renaissance is the widespread presence of slavery. Major Italian cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence were active hubs in the slave trade. Enslaved people were captured in military conflicts or bought from traders who brought them from Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Africa. These individuals were considered property, bought and sold in markets. They worked as domestic servants, laborers, and craftsmen. In Florence, historical records from a prominent orphanage show that between 1445 and 1485, nearly one-third of the abandoned babies taken in were the children of enslaved women. This fact alone points to a deeply embedded system of exploitation and sexual violence. The very wealth that allowed a merchant family to commission a painting could have been generated, in part, by the forced labor of human beings in their own household. Beyond slavery, this was also an age of persecution. As rulers consolidated power, they increasingly cracked down on minorities and dissenters. Jewish populations, for example, faced intense persecution and were often segregated into ghettos or expelled from their homes entirely, as happened with the mass expulsion from Spain in 1492. This was the price of the Renaissance. The social order that produced great art was also one of systemic oppression, exploitation, and cruelty. So, the next time you see a masterpiece from the Renaissancia sculpture by Donatello or a painting by Raphael, look closer. Beyond the beauty, beyond the genius, see the hidden story. See the battlefield of the Italian wars. See the cold ambition of the Medici and the ruthless corruption of the Borgias. See the art as the propaganda it so often was. See the victims of religious massacres and the forgotten faces of the enslaved. The Renaissance wasn't a simple, glorious rebirth. It was a complex, contradictory, and profoundly violent age. It was an era where humanity's greatest artistic achievements grew from the soil of its worst impulses. The beauty and the bloodshed weren't separate, they were inextricably linked. The divine art was paid for by mortal sins. And acknowledging that violent truth doesn't diminish the art. It makes it more complex, more challenging, and ultimately, more human. The story of the Renaissance isn't a lie because the art wasn't beautiful, but because the beauty came at a terrible, violent cost. If you found this look into the dark side of history compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. And let us know in the comments, what other historical golden age do you think is hiding a dark secret? We read all of your suggestions. Thanks for watching.